Okay, do you mind first, can you say and spell your name, please?
Sure. Roderick A. Ferguson, Roderick, middle initial A, last name Ferguson, Ferguson.
Great. And to start us off, could you give me an autobiographical sketch or thumbnail of your own travels through the world of higher ed, the institutions you've been at, the capacities that you've filled, and your kind of path through higher ed? Sure.
Yeah, I grew up in Manchester, Georgia, which is a small town, an hour and 15 minutes from Atlanta. I got a full scholarship to go to Howard University, D.C., and so I did my undergrad there. Was in sociology, and did my grad work at UC San Diego in sociology proper, but then quickly discovered that sociology was not didn't have the sort of range that I thought it would. And so I found my way to ethnic studies and to literature, and at the time, the sort of real figures of those departments at UC San Diego were George Lipsitz and Lisa Lowe. So then I also quickly became, part of that sort of conversation about, a shared conversation between, those folks, those departments, and the people who sort of, kind of orbited around that conversation. That was the nature of culture. And it was very much a kind of Birmingham school, articulation of culture for the U.S., but also for the state of California at that time. We're talking about the 90s, and so it was the beginnings of the anti-affirmative action movements, within California, that were claiming the sort of discourses of civil rights. And so that was my introduction to California and to UCSD after coming from Howard.
Yeah, can you talk a little bit about that transition for you?
Yeah, it was a difficult, transition in the sense that, I was used to a city and an institution, that kind of took black folks, you just saw black people everywhere, right? And also a sort of appreciation at Howard of the sort of complexity of black experiences. And so there was no sort of will to a monolith of a black identity or a black experience. Because everybody, so you could be the black Republican, you could be the black kid who was listening to Duran Duran, you could, in addition to being, the black feminist or the black nationalist, and nobody could use the sort of race card, if you will, and say that, oh, you're not black, that's why you're Republican. If that were an issue, you wouldn't be at Howard, right? And so there was a way in which, it, introduced me to a kind of, complexity of blackness, and, I felt relieved from having to take on the identity politics of blackness, ironically, too, right? It didn't have to be this one thing, because I was already in a place where it was many things. And then so, I left there to go to San Diego. The difficulty was that I was in a social department that, upon arrival, I was told that I was the first black male grad student in 20 or 30 years. I forget which one. And, that was difficult. So, I was quickly trying to find, and George Lipsitz was really key in helping me find, and produce community with black folks on campus. And also the generative thing, and productive thing, was that, I was also learned how to be in coalition with other racialized and ethnic groups, so with like Asian Americans and with Latinos, and that was also very important, for me, both intellectually and politically, so there was a way in which this sort of multicultural makeup of Southern California and the emergencies that were produced by anti-affirmative action movements, produced, ironically, these very interesting coalitional and intellectual possibilities for me.
Mm-hmm. So the kind of West Coast ethnic studies formation is something that then you kind of hung on to. And
yeah, I mean, it's what I know. It's what I identify with, in terms of race being dialogical, race being comparative, race not being reducible to a black-white model, You know, that was something that, you know, was nurtured and introduced to me in San Diego, and it makes sense.
So you finished your degree in the 90s?
In 2000, I finished.
2000, and then what are the positions you've held since then?
Well, so I was for 14 years at the University of Minnesota in American Studies, and solely in American Studies. I'm trying to think, what were my affiliations? I had an affiliation in gender and women's studies, gender and women's sexuality studies throughout. I had, toward the end, affiliations in theater and in cultural studies. Since then, I have moved to the University of Illinois, Chicago. In fact, I just moved there in August, at the end of August, as part of a research cluster initiative that Illinois, Chicago has mounted. That is, they're going to make 25 hires in the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, and based on a competition, a proposal competition, those hires have been divided into 5 clusters. One cluster is the racialized body, of which I'm the co-director or co-PI. Another cluster is Middle East and Muslim cultures. Another cluster, urban diaspora. Another cluster, urban migration. And another cluster, the 5th cluster, social justice. Each of which will have 5 lines in it. And the way it works is that the candidate decides which departments he or she will be in.
So all of the hiring is actually free from the departmental structure?
All of the hiring is freed from the departmental structure in theory. You know, like, you know, in practice, you have departments that want to make claims on, even before the candidate.
Yeah. Well, let's bracket that for a minute, and we'll come back to that. But three very different state institutions, very different states, but state institutions nonetheless. Can you talk a little bit about your own, just your, you know, from where you have sat in this, you know, 2 decades, kind of your own sense of the trajectory of public education, or the things that seem important in 2014 to get on the record about where we are in terms of our public education?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, if we were sort of to look backwards, I mean, certainly like the issues that are important in 2014 have to do with, you know, student debt, but also, you know, the ways in which that reverberates and implicates, you know, students of color. You know, if we can trace that, you know, in fact, to, you know, something like the anti-affirmative action, you know, moments, you know, in the 90s, you know, which, you know, the UC system was a kind of lightning rod for that particular issue, as was the state of California, you know, which passed the Proposition 209, which outlawed affirmative action within the state. You know, that kind of became a model for other anti-affirmative action efforts in other states. And, you know, as I said, that was a really sort of politicizing moment, you know, for me around, you know, comparative racializations, you know, because all of a sudden at UCSD, my first year, there were all these, you know, relatively speaking, Latino students, and, you know, a smaller number of black students. And I remember the year afterwards, you just didn't see them on campus, especially the, you know, Latino students, Chicano students. The numbers for black students, you know, dwindled as well, right? So that was happening in California. And as I said, there were these really fantastic efforts, you know, politically and intellectually by folks to address that, you know, at UC San Diego.
Was there a feeling of racial animus on campus at that point?
Yeah, I was new at that time, you know, 94. There was the racial animus, but not in, you know, in a kind of virulent or aggressive way. In this sort of, you know, among the, you know, for instance, the whites who were opposed to affirmative action, the idea, you know, was the moment of the, you know, idea that what was keeping whites out of the university was affirmative action, right? Which seemed so crazy to me because there were so few people of color, you know, so I couldn't see, you know, where are these boogeymen,
Right.
You know,
Who's being displaced?
Right. Who's being displaced
by this 2%?
Right. Because my reality was that I was the first black male grad student in 20 or 30 years. So I couldn't. It just didn't make any sense to me. But yet and still, there was that sort of animus without necessarily having, the embodied reason for the animus, right? And when I got to Minnesota, so I moved from a state where affirmative action was outlawed to a state where affirmative action was still on the books, and it's still on the books, and yet it looked very much like California in terms of the makeup of departments, the graduate student body, the undergraduate student body, and I couldn't get that out of my head, that affirmative action is on the books here, and yet it looks almost identical to the institutional makeup, at UC San Diego, right? So there was an issue, not of a sort of formal exclusion, but an informal exclusion. So then it became an issue for me and my colleagues of color, junior colleagues of color at the time. So how do we penetrate that, and how do we intervene into that? And so one of the things that we decided to do was to form this group called the Faculty of Color Initiative, or FOCI. And, we had a proposal that we took to the deans, after we decided that we needed to go to the deans. I was one of those who didn't really see the purpose in going to the deans, that we could sort of produce an intellectual community and a kind of institutional project without, soliciting monies from the deans. But, I was outvoted on that. And so we went to the deans, and I was acting as the sort of chair at the time and, leading the discussion with the deans. The deans gave us money to do a kind of affirmative action program intervention within the CLA, the College of Liberal Arts there. So what we said to them was that this place, Minnesota, has an issue with people of color. We don't have any, faculty of color in particular. And there were about 10 of us.
I imagine their default position is just, well, this is Minnesota.
No, this is the thing. There was a dean from Michigan. Yeah, from Michigan, who actually wanted to make this part of his platform, right? So he said to us, "You're right. Tell us what ideas do you have for us?" He was actually great then, Stephen Rosenstone. And so what we said to them is that, the normal way of thinking about affirmative action is that you're just bringing in bodies of color. But in fact, this is an effort to bring in intellectuals of color. So the question has to be, what sort of institutional resources and structures have to be in place to make this an intellectually accommodating place for intellectuals of color, right? And we also said to them, one way to sort of mark Minnesota as a place that is interested in doing just that, and interested in the work, that's typically produced by intellectuals of color around race and sexuality and feminism, political economy and culture, is to have a national lecture series, a high-profile lecture series that marks Minnesota as a place that's interested in that. And then, we also said to them that if you lean on the chairs of departments who have searches to contact us when a search is announced, we will help them put together a list of graduate students and faculty to target, to go after, to recruit, for these positions. We will also then meet with them, once they come on campus for their interviews, and give them a sense of what are the intellectual and social possibilities here, right? We will also do workshops on how to recruit and retain faculty and graduate students of color, all of which we did. That being said, great, why don't we give you a budget of $60,000 in addition to an RA who can help you with these things. So things were moving along. He leaned on the chairs contacted me. I set up the lunches with the people. We also had the workshops. Now keep in mind, we're junior faculty, all right? So, we're also doing our own readings about
Were there no senior faculty?
There were no senior faculty.
Were there allies?
There were senior faculty allies.
Or fellow travelers, kind of?
Yeah. It was a situation in which I think we took on that task because, Minnesota was a place, especially for the senior faculty who preceded us, where people felt very isolated. They were unsupported in, departments that weren't necessarily favorable toward diversity. And so there was a lot of, burnout. And a lot of people with war wounds.
Mm.
And so they weren't necessarily in a position to advise us. They were in a position to be allies, but they couldn't necessarily.
It's like this fight can't be mine anymore.
Yeah,
that kind of time.
Right. So they decided that their efforts would be placed elsewhere, mainly outside the university. So we did that, and we began to see, especially I did, because I was still acting as a chair of the Factor Color Initiative, and so I was receiving the phone calls, I was talking to the chairs of other departments, I was arranging the visits with the candidates, that we were living the very thing that people who study these things talk about, and that is the faculty of color and also women, producing the conditions whereby they will stay in an institution, and all the kind of problems that produces in terms of people being over-serviced,
Mm-hmm.
under-researched, and so so that was part of the complication thing, and it was a real education. Great thing,
I mean, just to
yeah,
to kind of state the paradox here, so that you're doing all this work to make yourselves less vulnerable, but in doing all that work, you're making yourselves more
vulnerable. Right, exactly, right. But at the same time, the place changed overnight. Like, as one of my senior colleagues said, white woman, that all of a sudden they were a faculty of color, and she didn't know how it happened. So we saw the visible changes. Like, people were hired in English, people were hired in sociology, people were hired in cultural studies, in African American studies, in history, in American studies, in gender and women's studies, in theater. It was an amazing kind of sea change.
Over a year or 2 or 3?
Or 2 years. And it was also a moment where you had a dean who was willing to sort of push the effort through and hold department chairs' feet to the fire. And also, there was money for hiring, right? Like, when I came in, I was one of 78 people hired in the College of Liberal Arts alone in 2000. And, and so we saw the real, even though, we could feel our vulnerability, it was also, oh my God, look how things are changing, mm-hmm. right? The thing that really sort of got us to think twice, though, about what we were doing and how we were doing it, wasn't the vulnerability part mainly. It was the part where we were taken to be an auxiliary of the dean's office. So people like chairs were calling me, sometimes irate about why I had scheduled lunches for their candidates, as if I were, an administrative associate, in the dean's office. That was one. And then also two, so we were also, became a kind of poster child for the College of Liberal Arts. And
so
then,
it was inorganic to the faculty.
Yeah, it was out of step with our purpose. Our purpose wasn't to be an auxiliary for the administrative offices, mm-hmm. and to be poster children. Right? Because that is also part of the sort of vulnerability, right? Like, you're the poster child, but you're also the sort of poster child who's very, very vulnerable, right? And so you're on the one hand, there's a kind of fetishization going on, mm-hmm. and a kind of deprivation, going on. But the thing that really sort of got my attention was that we had strayed away from our original ideals. So originally we wanted to sit in on each other's courses. We wanted to read each other's manuscript drafts. It was supposed to be an intellectual, exercise. And what we noticed after we got the money, which was a lot of money for junior faculty to have to manage, $60,000, we were all focused on the budget, singularly focused on the budget, narrowly focused on the budget, and that it overtook all other considerations. So we forgot this other stuff about like being colleagues and reading each other's work, going to each other's classes, talking to each other about, lectures that we were doing, or, this, what do you think about this assignment for students, which is that. And we were, just really focused on like the budget. And it was also the period of the Lord of the Rings. So we were likening it to like the Precious, the ring, and so we saw a kind of bureaucratic subjectivity emerging within us. And it was alarming to us. And so what we decided to do, we had like $10,000 left. We decided, $8,000 or $10,000 left. And we decided to give the money back. And disaffiliate from the dean's office. In other words, we would not take any monies from the deans anymore. We would do things like continue the work to put together the list for folks. We would meet with the candidates, but we would not, produce the conditions whereby we would have to pay the piper. And that was significant for me because it also began to introduce a lesson for me around the benefits and limits of formalization versus the benefits and limits of informal agencies, within institutions. So the moment that we said we were going to informalize, it was an amazing moment where like people just kind of all of a sudden like their imaginations were unleashed. So they said, someone said, let's have a barbecue at my house. And another person said, let's do this thing where we meet once a month, for happy hour. And then the amazing thing, we called it TGI Foci, right? The happy hour that met once a month. The amazing thing about it is that before that, when we were a formal entity, right, the only people who participated were people from the University of Minnesota, okay? When we informalized and became, we're doing the TGI Foci, everybody showed up. If you were a curator of color at the Walker Art Center, you showed up to TGI Foci.
People like Setu Jones.
Exactly, right. Or Yasmil Raymond, who is now like, one of the hot new, curators, in the country. Like did the Kara Walker retrospective, did the Andy Warhol thing at the Hirshhorn, is now, at one of the New York museums, and so if you were a faculty of color at one of the liberal arts in the area, you came to TGI Foci. So immediately with informalization, the sort of networks and webs of affiliations began to expand. And out of that, people started to do projects with one another, across institutions, especially like articles together. And, one of my favorite moments was when we had a candidate who was being considered for a position in gender and women's studies. And so there were all these folks at this lounge called Caterpillar Lounge, all these faculty of color. And there was a friend of one of the members who was visiting, one of the members who was from another institution, St. Kate's in St. Paul, who was visiting from Brooklyn, a black queer woman. And then in the middle of it, she says, I wish we had this in Brooklyn, And it really taught me that there's a lot of unacknowledged and unrecognized forms of agency within informalization. That, we don't have to bank every effort on whether or not we have formal ties, to a dean's office or to some administrative office. There are other things that one can do to actually produce change that aren't about like getting license, from the formal structures.
Right. Although, so this is fascinating because there are these two halves to your story, and both halves have their appeal.
Mm-hmm.
So you're the beginning of your story where you're talking about institutionalizing all these things, even though that becomes in a way a kind of cautionary tale, it also sounds like something that ought to be replicated at a lot of places.
Yeah.
So where are you in your thinking now about so if one were starting from scratch and wanted to take the lessons seriously that you've learned, what would the blueprint look like?
Yeah, well, I think like for me, I'm at the place, at the institutionalization place, the formalization place, right? Because I'm now at Illinois Chicago, I was hired to be the co-director to build a research cluster, to make the hires, to talk to the deans, to talk to the chairs, so that is the site of formalization, and part of what attracted me to it is that, wow, this is a really interesting project around formalization, at this institution. So what it means is that, well, one, I have to figure out, okay, well, what are the parameters for formalization here, right? If you want to have a hire, around this area, who are the people that I need to talk to, in departments, heads, how are joint positions done here, if there are folks who are interested in, having affiliations in other colleges, how do I do that? How do I arrange that? For folks. So, the formalization is necessary, right? At the same time, I also have to then think about, ways in which to sort of critically withdraw from the formalization and somehow install that into the effort as well, right? Because, something like, this project, the cluster initiative, which, was dreamed up by the faculty, promoted by the chancellor, can also become, one of the things that, the institution uses, to sort of justify itself, which is thorny in this particular moment, right, in the University of Illinois system, because you've got the clusters going on, that are promoting forms of interdisciplinarity and diversity, and yet someone was just fired, a Palestinian scholar, fired for his tweets, right? So, in many ways it is a sort of effort about, how do we strategically align with formal opportunities and recognizing that those opportunities also come with their costs, and that we need to also have and build in, these sort of informal efforts, right, that can't be entirely claimed, right, by the institution. So,
yeah. Well, the informal and the formal, trying to mesh those is one set of challenges. Earlier on, you were talking about how the clusters were only kind of in theory, kind of outside of the departmental structure. So even the formal piece has its own challenges.
Exactly, right.
So
right.
What has that looked like, or what? How would you describe the kind of institutional challenges of trying to do something?
I think the institutional challenge has to do with anytime you have, an injection of resources in one place, especially in an atypical place, right, where you have with these structures, people get to choose where they go. Right? So there's not, the departments, their usual priestly powers are not activated. In other words, lines are not given to them with the announcement of jobs. The lines are sort of held, within the central administration, and then the candidates decide where the lines will go, right? Now, you also have a moment in which the departments are not getting their own lines, their traditional lines. Right? So then the departments are then looking at the cluster lines.
So they're circling like sharks.
Exactly. Right. And so, so my job there is to, one, do two things. One is to sort of help people articulate the distinctions between the departmental line and the departmental interests versus the cluster lines and the cluster interests. They're not the same thing, right? Mm-hmm. That's one thing I have to do. The other thing I have to do is also make a case for why the departments should get their own lines, their traditional lines, right? Mm-hmm. So that they don't see that they have to have an antagonistic relationship to these cluster lines, which, by the way, will end up in many of the departments.
Right. Well, so is it the case then that the traditional departments will kind of de facto end up being the building blocks of interdisciplinarity?
Some of them will, yeah. And, one of the interesting things that's tended to happen is that people tend to select, a lot of people are selecting split appointments, and they'll have a split in like a traditional department and in an interdisciplinary one. I'm the exception in that my split appointment is in two interdisciplinary departments. But I think most people are going to do the former, right? And they're going to split between an interdiscipline and a discipline. So, in many ways, if a department is thinking right, the way to sort of maneuver that, favorably for yourself is actually to present yourself as
a hospitable place
for interdisciplinary work. So the sort of aggressive and combative behavior doesn't work. I mean, just even as a practical strategy, for something like this, because these people will have to go somewhere, and many of them will want to consider departments, but they would like to consider departments that have a proven record of, being favorable toward diversity and favorable toward interdisciplinary scholarship.
So, can you talk a little bit about, let's go back, you were talking about, all of this, everything you've described at all three institutions, for you, it sounds, in a very salient way, is taking place in a kind of post-assault on affirmative action universe. I think most white people, both in and outside of education, don't think of this as being a post-assault on affirmative action universe. So can you just talk a little bit more about the relationship between that and the kind of diversity initiatives that you're talking about on the one hand, with the other kinds of assaults on the university that we've been living through, the neoliberal university, the austerity programs. All of these things are kind of hinged in various ways. I wonder your view of that.
Well, the way I try to talk about it, just as a scholar, is in terms of, the assault on affirmative action, the sort of neoliberal production of the university as about, producing a kind of entrepreneurial university, a university that sort of withdraws from the sort of curiosity-driven, research. They're really about sort of narrowing the constituencies, of the university, right? Like, one has to do with narrowing the constituencies of women and faculty of color, and also students of color. The other one has to do with narrowing the constituencies of people who are coming to the university for curiosity purposes, for purposes of critical thinking, right? Those are not unrelated in my mind, right? In fact, the birth of, sort of interdisciplinary work, as the sort of, our most recent model of curiosity-driven, work, was also then the sort of birth of the affirmative action university. Right? So that when you have a sort of period in which, curiosity-driven work is assaulted, is expunged in the name of, a kind of entrepreneurial academic and an entrepreneurial institution, it's doing two things. It's narrowing the possibilities for critical and creative work that doesn't have to sort of stake its validity on how many dollars it's bringing in or how many corporations it's attracting. That has a real relationship to, and that's part of a narrowing of the actual sort of constituencies, that can take up curiosity, it can take up critical thinking. Right, and so in many ways, it's kind of completing, a project that was started with the anti-affirmative action, work in that kind of narrowing, right? What I saw in San Diego was people who were really trying to figure out, okay, so how do we continue, a sort of project of diversity, a project of critical thinking, in a moment where those things have now been outlawed, And so people were trying very creatively to do it. So, one of the things was that, I think it was called the California Initiative, or initiatives in the UC system, where they were trying to target people who were doing work on California, and use that as a kind of, I'm not sure if I can say this, a Trojan horse, for what used to be, sort of affirmative action, hires to get people who were thinking critically about California and in terms of race and in terms of gender and sexuality, their intersections, and, knowing that people who are going to be doing that kind of work, most of them are going to be, faculty of color,
Right, and the legislature will buy it.
And the legislature
so you could
will
say,
buy it.
So the California Constitution is one of the most important ethnic studies documents there is.
Exactly right. So that was a real lesson for me in terms of, so how do I work with, what seem to be, these sort of unmovable institutional boundaries, right? And also legal boundaries in some cases, like with the California thing, to sort of produce critical communities, minoritized communities, whether you're talking about, fact of color, or you're talking about queers, or you're talking about women, you're talking about disabled folks. So how do I do that, in these various settings? And the nice thing is that each institution, I kind of feel like each institution introduces me to various minoritized constituencies. So at Illinois Chicago, disability studies has the longest standing disabilities, or maybe the longest standing, if not one of the longest standing disability studies programs, in the country, right? So I have disability studies students in my course who are also disabled students, and so to think about, that group of folks as part of a kind of coalitional and critical vision, to produce within the structural limitations of UIC is really exciting to me. Really exciting to me when you have students who are trying to think, okay, well, how do I, how does the critique of settler colonialism or, might queer of color critique, push the boundaries of disability studies and produce different types of subjects within disability studies. So, at the same time that there are these real limitations, I also find it really exciting, too. So.
Yeah. Well, what you're describing is a really tight and organic relationship between your intellectual work and the political work of keeping the institution in line with its ideals, or with your ideals, or it's long lost ideals in some cases. But then the other side of that, so have you yet been able to find a way to do all of that work and yet also keep the tight and organic relationship between your institutional kind of professional work and the broader political world and the kind of outside the university politics?
Yeah, I feel like I've been fortunate in that I've been in these places that pushed me to do that was part of the assignment, or at least I imagine it is part of the assignment. It's certainly a part of the assignment in San Diego. Because, that's the kind of folks that George Lipsis and Lisa Lowe are. They were trying to get their students to sort of make these sort of, as you say, tight organic connections, and find ways to, expose and illustrate the worlds that are already operating within the institution, and that is to sort of also re-world the academy. And I felt like, that was certainly going on, in Minnesota, and it's certainly now, even probably more so at Illinois Chicago, right? Because Illinois Chicago is an interesting campus in that it's a very much a kind of scholar activist, campus, and so you have people who are trying to make those connections, all the time. And in many ways, the Research Cluster Initiative, is an outgrowth of that characteristic of that institution, right? So that the idea is also to bring people who are interested in Chicago, and who are interested in Chicago communities and Chicago politics, and so I've been very fortunate in being in these places that also present a model for the connections between outside the institution and what's happening within, and trying to sort of establish bridges there. For instance, one of the really exciting programs that the Social Justice Initiative there, that Barbara Ransby runs, is what's called a Pipeline to Justice program. And the idea, it's a pilot program in its first year. The idea is that you bring 4 community activists, usually in their 20s or 30s, who never went to college, who had to drop out for whatever reason, but have been recognized by their communities as significant, activists and organizers. So you bring them in and you matriculate them, and provide the institutional resources that UIC offers. They give you their knowledge about community organizing and the interventions that are needed and the possibilities that are open, within communities in Chicago. And it's amazing. I have one of the students in my feminist theory grad seminar, this guy Jason Perez, who's a national co-director for the Black Youth Project, in Chicago. And he's technically a freshman. Technically a freshman, okay? But from day one, it was clear that he was one of the best graduate students in the course. He had already done the readings. He'd already read Sheila Sandoval's Methodology of the Press. He had already developed the skills, to read theory. He had read the other texts, Jody Bird's Transit of Empire, Mama's Baby, Papa's Maybe, Horton Spillers, that he had read as part of his job as an organizer, right? I mean, so it's amazing what a program like that can do, in terms of bringing these people who are legitimate, organic intellectuals, and by hook and crook, have already built the skills that we associate with graduate study, So I feel really fortunate, in that way, But it's one could opt out of making those connections, right? But I actually think that that's, the university is a dismaying, institution. But it also is an institution that presents a new political ground, for thinking about the possibilities of institutional politics. This is where I am in my thinking now, right? That you think about classical political theory, the institutional ground that, is presumed there is the state, and what can be done, within the sort of limitations of states and blah, blah, blah. And I really feel that we're at a moment where, these other institutions are offering themselves up, exposing themselves as, legitimate institutional grounds from which to think and do political strategizing, politicization in general, whether you're talking about universities, whether you're talking about, art centers, and I think that there's a real excitement for me, in that, to sort of think, well, what would, Machiavelli's The Prince look like, if the ground isn't the state, the person isn't the prince, but the ground is the university, and the persons are, sort of progressive faculty, that's exciting. So, yeah.
So let's go back to your statement that the university is a dismaying institution. I think that so many people walk into it not thinking that that's what it's going to be. So are kind of knocked off, I think half the people in the institution are kind of off their game because they're not finding the thing they thought they were going to find in various ways. So and you've written a lot about education, and a lot of it has already come up in our conversation so far, but maybe there are pieces of it that you want to throw in too, from your own thinking and writing and theorizing the university. But is the goal to make it less dismaying, or is the goal to learn how to work within its context of the limitations that it presents itself with?
It's both. Because for me it's both, because part of working within its context, right, and part of the project of transformation is also to produce moments of happiness, for folks. Where they, I mean, this is sort of, I've been reading Lenin, like rereading Lenin for a year, and so actually with Jonathan Flatley, you know. And, you know, we had the same idea that, like, Lenin, the political theorist, is also an affect theorist. Mm-hmm. You know, so part of what he's talking about in that, you know, classic piece, What is to be Done, right, is not just the sort of institutional requirements for, you know, a social transformation, but also the affective resources that are needed for that institutional transformation. You can't have an institutional transformation if, you know, if you're depressed all the time. You know, there's got to be some sort of possibility for hope and happiness. Mm-hmm. You know, and so I do feel very much that, you know, they have to be done at the same time, right? And that doesn't mean that you have to sort of surrender to a program of delusion about what you're entering. Like, you can actually be very sober about what you see, right? And also, you know, have a vision for a hopeful vision of transformation, you know? And this is something actually that I didn't learn. I actually feel like I learned this from black women novelists, you know? If you think, like, open up any Toni Morrison, Beloved, you know, for instance, right? You know, it's about everything is in your face, right? Infanticide, you know, rape, you know, sort of brutalities of slavery, the lie of emancipation, right? And yet it's also about, you know, how does one produce, you know, these spaces, instances of real hope and transformation. You know, the scene with the clearing in the woods with baby sons. That's what that's about, right? And so in many ways, you know, for me, it is about, you know, sort of taking cues and inspiration from, you know, artistic moments like that, you know, to sort of figure out, all right, well, how does this translate as a kind of institutional and political project? You know, where you hold those two things in tandem. You know, that people have to be fed. You know, and that you know, feeding, inner feeding, is also part of and necessary for the institutional transformation. You know? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So you started your autobiography 45 minutes ago as a sociologist. Mm-hmm. Can you talk a little bit about how you arrived there as a very young man? Mm-hmm. Like, what did sociology mean to you at that point? But then also, kind of just speaking, kind of not just in disciplinary terms, but even just in a world of disciplines. Mm-hmm. Can you talk about kind of? I mean, this is between the lines of everything you've said, I think, but just your own trajectory through kind of thinking about disciplinarity.
Yeah. Well, you know, I started off as a journalism major at Howard, and quickly discovered that I hated journalism. And
for what reason?
Well, it just seemed too. It was really. I mean, I'm kind of embarrassed to say this, but it was really about. One of the deans said to us in orientation that we should only be getting 4 hours of sleep every night, and then the rest of the time we should be spending trying to get bylines at like local newspapers and things. And one, I'm not into self-mortification. I mean, it sort of goes back to the sort of the happiness. I've never been into self-mortification. That seemed crazy to me. I also, did realize that journalism wasn't going to give me the sort of creative outlet that I wanted, or the intellectual outlet that I wanted, to be quite honest. I had to take a sociology course as part of the journalism requirements, doing really well in that course. And I kind of got tapped by the professor who noticed that I had potential and said to me, if you become a sociology major, we'll work on getting you a fellowship to graduate school. This is my first year undergrad. I didn't know what graduate school was. I just knew I hated journalism. So I said, fine. But I also knew he taught the theory courses. He was one of the people who taught the theory courses, and I just found that fascinating. The idea that thought could have a history. So you teach a course called The History of Social Thought, and I just thought that's amazing. Just as a concept, right? This thing that we think of as a sort of, almost a kind of biological natural function thinking actually having, a history, right? And so that was that. He, was one of the first places where I kind of learned to read and learned to put text together. So in courses, his course, and in my philosophy course, honors philosophy courses, we would begin with Plato, and in the honors philosophy course, we begin with Plato. We ended with bell hooks. So that kind of juxtaposition was attractive to me, and I'd never seen anything like that. In his course, we read Feuerbach's The Essence of Christianity alongside the Book of the Dead and Martin Bernal. And those kind of pairings, I just never seen before, and as this sort of romantic student, it was what I wanted out of a college education, right? And then I also had another advisor. He was a civil rights veteran, right? He was actually, his name was Donald Addison. He taught at North Carolina State for years before moving on to Howard. He was actually Jesse Jackson's mentor when Jesse Jackson was, in North Carolina. And then I was taught social theory by Walter Katz Fishman, who Marxist-Leninist, professor at Howard in sociology, one of the founders of the activist group, an activist organization, Project South. And so from Walter, I was really looking for models of the radical intellectual. And I told her so. And, she gave me the best advice, that I kind of live by and pass on to other people to this point. And kind of ironic for a Leninist, too. She said, Rod, it's really great that you're looking to me as a model, for radical intellectual, but you really have to be your own model. And that was so liberating, for me. So that's kind of what I got from sociology as an undergrad that I thought would be represented in sociology grad programs, and it wasn't. So that kind of breadth, in reading, in self-creation, was not at all what I got when I went to graduate school. It was all about reining me in. We let in, this is how one of the evaluations read my first year, at the end of my first year. We let in this person who is situated in the margins of two disciplines, sociology and literature. And then that person scribbles something out. So whatever they wrote after that was worse than what they had just so my real salvation was literature, the lit department, and the ethnic studies department. So it was an amazing time that way. There was a real sort of restriction for me in sociology and an expansion for me in these other venues. And so it was really about how to make, how to get through the constriction through the expansion, which was the sort of interdisciplinary option on that campus, right? And, again, it was also an exciting time for interdisciplinary work at UCSD, through, again, George Lipsis was there, Lisa Lowe, Lisa Yoniyama, Rosemary George, Jack Halberstam was just finishing up Female Masculinity. It was also a moment in which, there were all these interesting postdocs and graduate students who were, in the area who wanted to start a writing group. Ruby Tapia actually was a grad student then in ethnic studies, and part of the first graduate cohort. She wanted to start a writer group with, sort of fellow travelers. And so all these people became part of the writing group. So Grace Hong was in the writing group, and all of our projects came out of that. Her book, the first book, The Ruptures of Capital, came out of that. Aberrations in Black, I was working on the dissertation that became that. Guy Gopinath was a postdoc working with Lisa, Low, Impossible Desires came out of that writing group. Chandan Reddy.
Chandan, yeah, I was thinking about him.
Exactly. Chandan was dissertating. He had done his undergrad at San Diego. He was on fellowship from Columbia, decided to come back to San Diego to write. He was part of that group. The beginnings of Freedom of Violence, came out of that group. Victor Bhaskara had just finished, was in between, finishing at Columbia and starting his first position at University of Georgia. Model Minority Imperialism completed in that group. Ruby's, American Pietas. The beginnings of that project were from that group.
It's extraordinary.
Yeah, no, it was an extraordinary time, right? And so it was also then a moment where I was thinking about sociology, in a kind of Foucaultian way, as a sort of knowledge formation that was producing these discourses about race and sexuality. They were the perfect group to help me think that through. It was also the moment in which, there were four of us. I remember it was a dinner that began Queer Color Critique, where Mark Montalonson was in town to give a talk. This is before Global Divas came out. We were having dinner over to Jack Alberstan's place. Gayatri Gopinath was there, me, Chandan. And we just wandered into a conversation about what should be the new step in queer studies. And someone said, the new step in queer studies should be political economy. And then I thought, okay, I can do that. I can help start that. And so, I started to rewrite the dissertation project as an address to the critique of capitalism, which I had sort of gotten, because again, I was a student of Waldo's, Walter Cass Fishman, Marxist-Leninist. In sociology, you sort of are introduced to and you pick, from the Godhead, Marx, Weber, or Durkheim. I kind of picked Marx, because I knew that. So I was like, oh, I can do this. And that, kind of began Queer Color Critique too. So it was an extraordinary time, and I learned a lot from it, in terms of producing critical formations. And also, these were informal critical formations, too. It's not like we had money from anybody. Mm-hmm. There was no money to be had at UC San Diego, not for the humanities and social science.
And certainly not for Queer Color Critique.
And not for Queer Color Critique, and not for this group. Yeah. And so, but again, all of these amazing projects came out of that little group, that little writing group, And it was important for us to help each other develop our languages, Mm-hmm. So I knew it was, where I learned about South Asian sexualities. And, I was part of the production of that language with Gayatri's book, where I learned to think about women of color feminism, literature and its relationship to capital through Grace, where I learned, race and motherhood and mourning, through Ruby's book, where I learned about Chicano hip hop and post-industrialization in California through Victor Viesco, and so we were helping each other produce each other's idioms, So it was a kind of model for coalitional and comparative intellectual engagement.
Mm-hmm. So. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's incredibly inspiring. We're almost out of time, and we've covered an awful lot of ground, which is great. Are there any things that you haven't said that you feel like you should say? And in particular, are there practical and realistic interventions on the part of educators, both mm-hmm. students and faculty alike, mm-hmm. That you want to urge?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the urging has to do with things like, if formalization. If you have, a job line or job lines, use it as a moment to think outside the box. It can be a moment. Most people use it as a moment of social reproduction, right? To sort of reproduce what has already been done, what the disciplines have already legislated can be done. It doesn't have to be there. They don't. Like, you can actually use it as a moment to sort of reflect on your own social reproduction within a discipline, and then also to sort of hold that at bay so that you can produce room for something else. That was one of the exciting things about these hires at UIC. They're categories that we've never seen before. Racialized body, Middle Eastern Muslim, social justice. You never see hires like that in categories like that. So in many ways it is about, like, how do we serialize whatever the imagination was and whatever the chutzpah was to produce that kind of moment. How do we serialize it at other institutions, right? So, I mean, that's one thing. But also, two, is to, for years people have said, like, one of the things that has, that works against us is that if you're the only one coming in, right? So to, try and get institutions to provide the resources for collective productions. The cluster model is one model, for that. But we can actually use institutions to dream otherwise. I think that's also part of the exciting thing for me. There's an essay that Judith Butler wrote around the anti-affirmative action, or maybe after the anti-affirmative action stuff in California, in that Michael Rogan anthology. I forget what that anthology is called, but her piece is called An Affirmative View, or something like that. And there's a lovely part where she talks about how the opportunity that we have when you get that student's application, who may not have, like, the best SAT scores or whatever, but, is that minority student, and then the moment that you allow yourself to dream what that student can do, given where that student has come from, what they've announced as their interests, and what that might look like, in an intellectual project and in an intellectual trajectory, right? So that kind of, will to dream, that's what we can do. We can actually help students and junior faculty realize a dream of transformation, and it starts with, the very small things that we can count as our capacities, right? We teach people we read, we write. We teach people to read, we teach people to write. That's what that Ruby's reading group, this is what we nicknamed it, was about. Like, helping each other read and helping each other write. And all of the books that came out of that, and all of the sort of institutional and social worlds that it produced, from it. There's no way in which I could have helped to produce something, that happened at Minnesota, or would have even seen something like the cluster initiative at Illinois Chicago as viable, if it weren't for a group like that. Grace Hong helped to start this writing group of women of color faculty in the Southern California system. Eric Edwards' book came out of that, and so did Eric Edwards' tenure. Deb Vargas's book came out of that, and so did Deb Vargas's, tenure. Jana Brown, Jody Kim. The list goes on and on. So, the idea is to sort of, produce these spaces by which, you can help people come to full fruition. That's the happiness, and that's the transformation together. So.
Well, thank you so much.
Sure. It was a pleasure.